Alright, welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today I'll be making apple hand pies from Rodney Scott's cookbook. And to start, I'll go ahead and cut up the butter into small pieces and put that in the refrigerator while I mix up the dry ingredients. And the dry ingredients for this recipe are just the salt and the flour. And for the flour, I like to use a spoon to help measure it out so the flour doesn't get compacted, so it's a more accurate measurement. And I go ahead and whisk those together. Next, I get some ice and I add about half a cup of water to it to make sure that the butter stays nice and cold while we're forming the dough. Then I go ahead and add the butter to the flour and I toss it together with my hands just to coat the pieces of butter with the flour before pressing the butter in between my fingertips to break it into smaller pieces. The goal is to get pieces that are about the size of small peas, but some of the pieces I left a little bit bigger than that. As long as you don't have giant pieces of butter, you'll be fine. Next, I measure out the half cup of ice water and add about 3 tablespoons of it to the flour mixture. And I just toss it together with my hands until the flour has absorbed all that water. And then I continue to add more water, 1 tablespoon at a time, until the dough kind of comes together more. I ended up having to use a little bit more water than what the recipe calls for. The recipe says to use half a cup, but I ended up adding an extra 4 tablespoons on top of that to get the dough to come together. Also, the recipe emphasizes that during this step that you're not pressing the dough together or kneading it at all. So I tried my best to keep my hands open and kind of just toss the dough until all of it became moistened and stuck together. So at this point, the dough is kind of holding its shape together, and this is when you can give it a few kneads to just bring it together that last little bit so it holds its shape. And then we're going to split that into 2 rounds, about 5-inch discs, and then wrap it in plastic wrap just so we can put that in the refrigerator and it'll rest for about 3 hours. While the dough is in the refrigerator, I can get started on the pie filling, and I'm just going to remove the core of all of my apples and then chop it into about 1-inch cubes. Of course, it's not the easiest to cut a sphere into a cube, so it's not that big of a deal that you get them all the exact same size. Next, I juice a lemon, and I just need a teaspoon of lemon juice to add to the apples, but I squeeze a whole lemon and add that teaspoon into the apples, followed by a 1/3 cup of apple juice. This is technically apple cider, but it doesn't really make that big of a difference in my opinion. In another bowl, I'll add a 1/4 cup each of dark brown sugar and regular sugar, followed by 2 teaspoons of cornstarch, as well as a teaspoon of salt. And for this, since the brown sugar is a little clumpy, it's okay if you leave some clumps in there when you whisk it together. As long as it's broken up for the most part, then I'll add that to the apples and stir it. Finally, I'll add some vanilla extract and some cinnamon. The amount of cinnamon is up to you. The recipe doesn't give a specific amount, it says a pinch. I'll stir that together and then I'll add it to an 8x8 baking sheet or baking pan and put that in the oven to bake for 20 minutes. And after 20 minutes, I'll give it a stir just to make sure it's cooking evenly. And then I'll put that back in the oven to bake for another 25 minutes. And after baking for a total of 45 minutes, I give it another stir and then I let it sit out for 30 minutes before I put it in the refrigerator to cool off for another 2 hours. I let my dough rest in the refrigerator for about 4 hours, and at that point I was ready to roll it out. So I floured my work surface as well as the top of the dough, and the recipe says to roll it out to about 1/4 of an inch thick, but I rolled it out thinner than that. I don't think a 1/4 of an inch was quite accurate. Plus, the recipe says you're supposed to get 12 rounds out of this, and there's no way that I was going to get a total of 12 with the amount of dough that I got, especially if I roll it out to a 1/4 of an inch thick. So I don't have a 6-inch round cutter, so I use this 6-inch bench scraper to kind of help me trace a circle that was about 6 inches. And I did that by indenting the dough slightly with the bench scraper and then just using a paring knife to connect the dots pretty much. Now I can go ahead and make my egg wash, which is just an egg and a tablespoon of water. I whisk that together. Next I take the apples out of the refrigerator and give it a quick stir before I start assembling the hand pies. And I brush the edges of each round with the egg wash. Then I add a quarter cup of the apple filling. Then I just fold it over and press the edges into each other to kind of seal it up. And I'll just repeat that for each round. The dough is actually pretty elastic, so it might seem at first that the dough can't reach the other side with the filling inside of it, but if you just stretch it a little bit, it'll be perfectly fine and it won't tear or burst open. Like I mentioned earlier, the recipe says that you should be able to get 12 pies out of this dough in this recipe, but I was only able to get 8. And to do that, I just had to recombine and roll out the scraps from each round to get those extra 2 pies. And to finish them off, I just brush them with some egg wash on top and then sprinkle them with a little extra sugar before I put them into the refrigerator to rest for at least 15 minutes. I let mine rest in the refrigerator for about 30 minutes. And after those 30 minutes, I went ahead and took them out of the refrigerator and pretty much put them straight into the oven to bake for about 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, they were pretty golden brown, so I took them out and transferred them to a paper towel lined plate just to get them off of the kind of greasy baking tray. I let them cool off for about 30 minutes and then I gave them a try. So what did I think of Rodney Scott's apple hand pies? Well, the first thing I noticed is that they have a great crunch. And on top of that crunch, that crust is very buttery and has more flavor than you might expect from a dough that just has butter, salt, and flour. Moving on to the filling, the sweetness is pretty much perfect to me and it really lets the apples take center stage. There aren't a lot of other ingredients that are going to overshadow those apples. And the last thing I want to say about the filling is that it has a really good texture. Everything is nice and soft and smooth and it's not runny at all. And it really just holds together really well in the center of that hand pie. So I ended up giving this recipe an 8 out of 10. The only thing that I'm going to knock it for is that the amount of water I think is just wrong and that can end up causing some trouble when you're making it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you have any recommendations, let me know.